Hello and welcome to Biosecurity Practices in Horticulture. So this is a session to cover Duty 7 of your apprenticeship, and we will be talking about protecting plant health and ecosystems today. Now, just before we get started, I'd like you to be aware that you can pause this video at any point to take notes, and you can follow the links in the slides that will be given to you. So without further ado, here we go. Just a quick overview. We're going to talk about the importance of biosecurity. We've got the main introduction routes for pests and diseases, including plant pests. We're going to talk about horticultural plants and plant pathogens, legislation and relevant bodies, biosecurity in horticultural practice as a whole, and the important resources and further reading for your learning. So first off, what is biosecurity and what's the importance of biosecurity? So biosecurity is a global issue which affects trade, invasive species, pests and diseases, and pests and diseases can travel from anywhere to anywhere. So to give you an example of how global the concern for biosecurity is, the UK helps to ensure a healthy supply of chocolate by housing the quarantine for cocoa trees at the University of Reading in Berkshire. So a quarantine is usually a set of greenhouses, so they're used to keep imported hazardous plants separate to contain potential pathogens. Now, a good description of what biosecurity is and the importance of it is taken from the Forestry Commission here on the slide, and it is a term that encompasses a set of precautions that aim to prevent the introduction and spread of harmful organisms, and these include non-native pests such as insects, plants and disease-causing organisms, and these are all collectively called pathogens, such as bacteria, fungi and so on. Now, why is biosecurity important in horticulture? So horticulturists can help prevent the spread of pests and diseases and protect against the economic and environmental impacts of a biosecurity breach. Imported pests and diseases can have a huge negative consequence for the natural world, for horticulture and agriculture as industries, and ultimately the economy. So you can see that in the infographic above. On the right hand side, you can see the potential threats screened through the UK Plant Health Risk Register, and you can see there's hundreds of potential threats to the UK's biosecurity, and they affect a range of different industries within forestry and horticulture. So you've got forestry, field grown crops, ornamental crops, greenhouse crops, and orchard crops, and you can see there's 85 pests alone for orchard crops, 160 for greenhouse crops there, so there's quite a few. And this is taken from the UK Plant Health Register, as I mentioned, and the pests and diseases included here are effectively quarantine pests. So they're ones that are notifiable or quarantine, so they're the ones we're really trying to stop from spreading or getting into the UK in general. Invasive plant pests, so the likes of knotweed, hogweed. We're talking about 2 billion cost to the economy per year, so that's just the plant species alone. And as we can see from the graph on the left, the cost of prevention is very, very low compared to the cost of control. So you can see at that point here, just get my little laser pointer, you can see here this is the species introduction, and at this point, if it's not eradicated, that grows exponentially, and eventually it becomes quite hard to treat, not impossible, but quite hard to treat, and it comes into sort of long-term management plans then as something that we sort of have to live with. And you can see that there's the control costs here and time along the bottom. So as time goes on, the cost of control goes up. So common biosecurity threats in horticulture can be broken down into 3 types of what we call pathogens. These 3 types are pests, diseases, and invasive non-native plant species. What I'd like you to do, working in a group or on your own, is see if you can identify the differences on the slide between the pests, the diseases, and the invasive plant species. So what looks like a pest, what looks like a disease, and what looks like an invasive plant species. So have a little go, and I'll pull the answers up in just a few minutes. So, how did you get on? We've got lots of lovely goodies on here. We've got some plant pests. So we've got cherry laurel, Japanese knotweed, giant hogweed, parrot's feather, and rhododendron ponticum. We've got some diseases over here. So we've got Xylella, Phytophthora blight, box blight, and Dutch elm's disease. And we've got some insect pests, so we've got box moth and box moth again. So, as I mentioned, one of these pathogens is Japanese knotweed, and this was introduced to Britain to stabilise railway embankments, which it's very good at doing, owing to a strong and fast-spreading rhizomatous root system. Now, additionally, knotweed can grow from a very, very small piece of this root. This trait, however, means that it can cover vast areas very, very quickly and cover native flora. Now, another danger can come from plant defence chemicals such as the sap of the giant hogweed here. You can see the size of that compared to the guy on there. Now, this contains a chemical which makes skin extremely sensitive to sunlight. And if that sap gets on your skin, it's then exposed to the sun, your skin can blister and burn very badly. Some of these non-native invasive plant species are hosts and vectors for plant pathogens. So a vector is an organism that transmits a disease from one plant to another. And this is usually a sap-sucking insect like an aphid or a whitefly, but a vector can also be the host plant itself. Now, on their own, both cherry laurel and rhododendron are causing enough problems for British woodlands as non-native invasive plant species invading habitats across the UK. Both cherry laurel and rhododendron grow in woodlands, and they will prevent native trees from sprouting up, effectively covering the entire forest by themselves. But rhododendron ponticum is also susceptible to Phytophthora ramorum blight, which is a wind and waterborne disease of plants that kills species used in the UK forestry industry, as well as our native oak species and horticultural plants such as Acer, Camellia, Hamamelis, Kalmia, Lonicera, honeysuckle, magnolia, Pieris, and many, many more. Cherry laurel, on the other hand, is a host of Xylella. Now, this hasn't got into the UK yet because of the controls, but it's still a threat to UK biosecurity. And cherry laurel is a vector of Xylella, and therefore it can be dangerous to have this in areas where wild plants really should be growing. Xylella is a pest disease of olive trees in mainland Europe, and thus it needs to be controlled regardless of whether it affects economic species in the UK. Please take a few minutes to watch this video. In the video, Callum talks about why rhododendron ponticum is such a problem for the British landscape, its ecology, and the trouble of controlling rhododendron as a non-native species. So, what makes an invasive plant? Lots of these invasive plants have very, very similar characteristics, which help them to spread and take over areas where otherwise native plants would grow. These characteristics include rapid growth and maturity, highly successful seed production, dispersal and germination, rampant vegetative spread, and the ability to compete with native species because of that spread. So in the video with Callum there, Callum was trying to control rhododendron by repeated cutting. He may have also been treating the cut stumps with a herbicide to eradicate the plant. Now, it's important to point out that not all rhododendron species are invasive to the UK, and indeed there are 70,000 ornamental plants available to gardeners in Britain. Most of them are non-native, but most of them are not invasive. So just because it comes from somewhere else doesn't mean it's an invasive plant. Many do have the potential to be invasive, however, and those that, like rhododendron ponticum, are causing huge problems. And as we saw on that video, crowding and shading out the ground flora and young trees is a really common trait among invasive plant species, invasive non-native plant species. Now, rhododendron ponticum was first introduced to the UK via Gibraltar in 1763, and by 1893 it was being sold on London markets as a flowering pot plum. Now, you might be surprised to find out which of these common horticultural plants on the slide have become invasive. Many of which are still sold, even though they might even be listed on the Schedule 9 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act, meaning it is an offence to plant them. Now here are some garden escapees you might recognise. We've got Cotoneaster species. Now Cotoneaster has at least 5 ornamental species in Section 9 of the Wildlife Countryside Act 2010, and it invades cliffsides, chalk downland, limestone and calcareous and acid grasslands. And in Wales it's outcompeting a native Cotoneaster, Cotoneaster cambricus, and it's our only native Cotoneaster, and that's listed as critically endangered. The second here is Crocosmia cross Crocosmiflora, and that's also known as Montbretia. Now this one is mainly a problem in Cornwall, but Cornwall is home to sort of half of our native wildflower species in the Lizard Peninsula, and many of which of those are rare. So Montbretia or Crocosmia grows very, very quickly, outcompeting those native species. And it's a very difficult plant to control because it grows from underground storage organs called corms, and a herbicide treatment is needed for that because it's quite difficult to pull up. It could also be dug up, but you wouldn't be sure that you would have got all of those corms up. So a herbicide treatment is recommended for that one. Now, Symphoricarpus alba, otherwise called snowberry, spreads into dry banks and wooded areas, and you may have seen this around as an escapee from gardens, and it usually is adjacent to those gardens via its roots, so it grows as suckers from its roots. And the control methods for this one include digging up the plant. I mean, you could use herbicide on it as well. So Alchemilla mollis is the next one. That's lady's mantle, and that one is also found in woodlands. It's spreading across the UK into hedgerows and woodland edges, which are also home to a wide range of flora. Now, the control for this really is to not plant it around the edges and boundaries of land in the first place, and to dig up when necessary. We've got Gunnera species, and this has recently been listed as a plant that's not allowed to be sold or grown, as in Section 9 for the Wildlife and Countryside Act again. And we've got Gunnera manicata and Gunnera tinctoria, so at least 2 species, and there's possibly some hybrids as well. And they spread through and completely cover waterways with their rhizomes and their gigantic leaves. So you can see this guy's head in there, and this is the size of that leaf for that one. So it's really, really, really big. And it's quite difficult to control, and you usually need an excavator to dig that plant out and remove that plant, so a digger or an excavator. The next one here is Rosa rugosa. So this one here, and this one is mainly a problem in coastal areas and in dunes. Now dunes, again, we've got some of the most biodiverse dune systems here in the UK. One of them I know up in Cumbria, which is under threat from various different issues, but obviously invasive species is a huge one. And these grow in really dense stands, and the roots get into the very loose substrate of the dune ecosystem. So control is really through repeated cutting throughout the year, or by excavating the roots. So repeated cutting, just like the rhododendron, can also reduce the sort of energy in that plant and really cut back its ability to spread. Now, if you already have these species in your garden or on your land, you are not likely to be prosecuted simply for having them, but you are advised to control them. And for 36 plants listed by legislation, you are required to take all possible steps to remove them, and even if you didn't plant them. So it's your responsibility as a horticulturist to ensure that they're not allowed to spread. And as horticulturists, you can inform, educate and help stop their spread by not really planting them or encouraging the planting and not recommending them to your clients. So also to note, legally disposing of invasive species plant material can be complicated, which we'll get to later, and it's best to plan and read up on what you must do to protect the environment and to avoid a brush with the law in disposing of green waste which contains invasive species. So now we're going to move on to some of the legislation and requirements for biosecurity, including the movement of plants for international and national trade, which you may come across in commercial horticulture and when you're buying plants at the nursery or garden centre. Now, plant passports. So this is something that's come in fairly recently in this format anyway. So a UK plant passport is an official label that's needed for the movement of regulated plants and plant products within Great Britain and between the Crown dependencies. So plant passports ensure that plants and plant products are traced through the supply chain, and they sort of declare compliance with plant health requirements, such as being free from pests and diseases, which is essential for maintaining biosecurity. Now, some of you may have heard of a phytosanitary certificate before, so you might be wondering what the difference is between a plant passport and a phytosanitary certificate. So a phytosanitary certificate is a certificate meeting agreed international standards as opposed to just UK ones, and it's used for plant biosecurity purposes, and it's necessary for most plants and plant products, including wood products, isolated bark, being imported into the UK from third countries or exported from the UK to third countries such as Canada, China or Australia, and it is issued by a competent authority within those countries or within the UK. Now, a plant passport is for internal movement within Great Britain, but a phytosanitary certificate is for an international. Now, as you can see on here, this pelargonium has, otherwise known as geranium, but it is a pelargonium, this little tag, which is the plant passport. Now, on here you can see the letters A, B, C and D, and you can see that A, you have the name here, so this is Pelargonium zonale. The letter B is the ISO code for the member state of the producer, so in this case I think it's the Netherlands, followed by a hyphen and a 9-digit phytosanitary registration number. The letter C is followed by the plant's traceability code, and this may be supplemented with a QR code, hologram, a chip or other data carrier belonging to the traceability code. You can see here we've got some legislation and some relevant bodies here. The main piece of legislation is the Plant Health Act, and underneath that we have a relatively recent regulations here. So this is the Plant Health Phytosanitary Conditions Amendment EU Exit Regulations 2020, which can be found on gov.uk website. And this brought together a number of regulations and older bodies of law and codes of practice going back to sort of 1877. So you can see that biosecurity isn't a new thing. And underneath that we have the Wildlife and Countryside Act, which I've already mentioned, and that is mainly the Section 9 within that Act, and that is specifically to do with invasive plant species, but also the Wildlife and Countryside Act stipulates that you can't sort of say go and dig up plants from the countryside to use in your garden, which also does sort of help stop the spread of pests and diseases as well, because you're moving plants and soil around by doing that. Now, in terms of reporting pests and diseases, there are a number of people you can go to for this, and all of these places have websites. Now, we've got DEFRA, which is the Department for Environmental and Rural Affairs, and they will head up anything to do with biosecurity, pretty much everything to do with agriculture and the environment as well, and horticulture. And underneath them work APHA, this is the Animal and Plant Health Agency. So they work under DEFRA, delivering and advising on statutory services for the implementation of all of these biosecurity policies and methods. So those are the guys that will be at the border opening up packages. Those are plant health seed inspectors under APHA that will do that, and that's anything that comes into the country that's declared as plant material. Now, the Forestry Commission, that's here. These are the government agency formed in 1919, and they perform research and action on UK tree pests and diseases. So that's mainly for forestry, but obviously in terms of our own native woodlands, they will also be researching things like ash dieback, which is a huge issue at the moment. And we have ash everywhere, not just in forestry plantations, but in our own woodlands as well. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we've got PHSI. Now these are the plant health and seed inspectors. And here's one here, just inspecting some fruit that's come into the UK. And Observatory, so this one is a voluntary recording online, and they specifically want reporting for 22 high priority pests and diseases, and you can find out what those are on their website. In this section, we're going to be talking about biosecurity in your daily horticultural practice. And that will include some phytosanitary processes, which we'll get to on the next few slides. Now, what you can see in front of you is a 9-point horticultural code of practice, and that's from DEFRA, so the Department of Environment, Farming and Rural Affairs. And you'll see that you've got some pretty sort of basic information on what to do as a horticulturist in your daily practice. Some of these things are to do with legislation, and some of them are just best practice in horticulture to prevent the spread of invasive species, pests and diseases. So I'm just going to go through these. So you've got number 1, that is to dispose of plant waste responsibly. Now, as I mentioned in a previous slide, there is legislation surrounding the treatment of waste that has invasive species within it. So, most obviously, do not fly tip, and plant material should always be disposed of responsibly. So much can be composted or taken to a municipal plant recycling centre, but Japanese knotweed and giant hogweed and soil containing these plants is regarded as controlled waste. Now, there are legal restrictions on handling and disposing this controlled waste, and they should be dealt with appropriately and on site, and should never be composted or taken to a municipal recycling centre. Care should be taken to ensure that aquatic plants, both as whole plants or fragments, do not end up in watercourses, rivers, ponds, canals or anything else, and a trained and certified professional must deal with Japanese knotweed and Japanese knotweed contaminated waste. Now, your PA 1 and 6 will deal with spraying and legislation around spraying, but Japanese knotweed can also be injected, as can quite a few other plants, and this is a separate ticket, so it's good to know. Number 2, you should know exactly what you are buying and growing, and avoid using plants known to be invasive. Consider alternatives, and when using native plants, use those of a local origin if possible. Consider a non-native plant's qualities, its invasive qualities, when you exchange plants with friends or grow plants from imported seed. And ask your retailer or supplier whether any of the plants or seeds you're interested in are invasive. Now, obviously, DEFRA under AFA and the plant health seed inspectors do go around to commercial premises to check that they're not growing or selling these plants. So it's best to take a precautionary approach and follow the guidance contained in the Code of Practice. You should be aware that many species have several different names, so synonyms, and as a consequence of their being described more than once, or as a result of changes in taxonomy, such as transfer from one genus to another, you need to be aware that the same plant can have many, many different names. So number 3, take advice on the best control techniques. So invasive species can be difficult to control, but timely actions such as deadheading after flowering for species like Buddleia, which spread by seed, will reduce the scale of the problem. So it's up to you as a horticulturist to really know what you're dealing with. Does it spread by seed? Does it spread by roots? And deal with that plant accordingly. And that will reduce the scale of the problem. So for plants with strong rhizomes and root systems, such as Japanese knotweed, obviously glyphosate is used, as mentioned, and either sprayed or injected. Now, number 4 is to control invasive and non-native plants safely. Care should be taken when using herbicides and machinery, particularly near water, and manufacturers' instructions and recommendations on mixing and using herbicides should always be followed. Number 5, be aware of relevant legislation. So I've gone through a few bits of legislation that you should be aware of regarding non-native plants and their safe control and disposal. So see in particular Section 14 and Schedule 9 to the Wildlife and Countryside Act. This is the prohibition on growing plants in Schedule 9, and Section 14 of that Act is the power to ban plants in Schedule 9. So in relation to the disposal of Japanese knotweed and giant hogweed, that is under the Environmental Protection Act of 1990. And there is a new Environment Act as well. So with suppliers and retailers, so this is number 6, you should know what you are supplying or selling if you go into commercial horticulture as a nursery producer or garden centre. And these plants needed to be labelled clearly and accurately. Invasive non-native plants are not good garden or pond plants anyway. There are usually many alternatives that are better suited. So where potential invasive non-native plants are sold, you should advise the customer of this and ensure that such plants are clearly and correctly named and labelled and given an indication of growth rates and identify dangers to the environment, if any. And avoid selling non-native plants which are known to be invasive and are already posing a threat to native biodiversity, but obviously in terms of legality, as under section 14, it's illegal to plant or cause to grow in the wild any plant which is included under Schedule 9. So when trading plants, you do need to be both clear and honest about those plants. If you are misleading in any way, you could find yourself committing a criminal offence. Under the Consumer Protection and Unfair Trading Regulations of 2008, and these regulations basically make it an offence to give consumers misleading advice on a product, and that includes plants. Always use the correct binomial name or Latin name in conjunction with the common name to avoid confusion. And if you're not certain of the correct Latin name, you should not be selling the plant. If you're unsure of what the plant is, do not sell it. But you can find correct binomial names on websites such as Plants of the World Online from Kew Gardens, and even Wikipedia is quite a good source for that. Number 7, you should really try to provide substitutes for invasive plants, and you can make native or non-invasive alternatives available for plant species that are known to be invasive. There are lots of plants known as nativars or genuinely native plants that can be very attractive, and it's quite good to encourage the growth of native plants, although a lot of ornamental plants can provide huge value for our wildlife too. If needed, you should seek advice about this from trades associations, conservation bodies, or other growers or retailers, and ideal alternatives should have similar characteristics to the invasive alien plant they replace, but not cause harm to native biodiversity and the environment. But as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the same traits and characteristics are what make those plants invasive in the first place, so I'm not quite sure where they're going with that one. Number 8, provide advice on disposal. So you should make sure that customers are made aware of the need to dispose of waste responsibly and are given advice on composting and are made aware of any relevant legal obligations such as buying and importing regulations. Number 9, and this is quite an important one going back to our vectors as well as our pests and diseases in general, be aware of hitchhiking pests in soil and on plants. So plant health regulations relate to pathogens, plant diseases and pests, and not to potentially invasive plants or seeds transported unintentionally. And so it's good practice to quarantine important plant material. There's that word again, quarantine. And so this is especially for new sources of plant material. You pop them in separately somewhere else and observe for a period of time. Topsoil should be free of weeds and all viable propagules of invasive non-native species. So that just means sort of seeds, rhizomes, corms, anything else that's in that soil that shouldn't really be there, that's not part of the plant or the roots of the plant that you've got. And you should always ask for a representative sample and seek guidance on the source and inspect it for yourself and inspect it on delivery. Now, I've worked in botanic gardens and we had holding places for a lot of plants that come in even from other botanic gardens, but we imported from European sources, and those were inspected. And personally stopped quite a few things from coming in. Some things are not even plant pests. Some can be, say, pharaoh ants, for example, which get into electrical machinery and devices, so they can be an issue in nursery stock. And other things like simple things like vine weevil anyway, which aren't non-native, but they will cause problems to your other stocks. So it's very, very good practice to do a little inspection first on those plants. Now, the code of practice is available and aimed at preventing the spread of flatworms as well. So non-indigenous flatworms are a problem in the UK now, and there is a code of practice simply for the flatworms, but really it does involve inspection again. So those hitchhikers can be various different things, from plants, diseases and pathogens as well. So a lot of the soil-borne pathogens, are obviously invisible to the naked eye, but can cause problems later. So it's good to be able to quarantine and see what happens, and then obviously that can lead to disposal if a problem is found, or everything's okay and those plants can go into your stock or be planted in your garden. Phytosanitary methods include good horticultural practice. So pruning and good pruning practice is a great way to prevent pest and disease in woody plants and trees. So you'll learn more about correct pruning in duty 10, but in short, pruning at the right time of the year with good technique can reduce the risk of pests and diseases entering the wound. And the larger the wound, the easier it is for pests and diseases to enter into the tree or woody plant. So this is especially true if you use clean tools and equipment and you don't spread disease from one plant to another by cleaning those tools and equipment very regularly between jobs. Now you can see here on the right you've got what's called gummosis on a cherry tree, and this is from incorrect pruning. Cherries are pruned at certain times of the year, so June, July, August and September, and not pruning at the right time of the year can be quite serious for cherries, and they do get bacterial canker, silverleaf, among other pests and diseases from incorrect pruning and wrong time of the year. And the poor old cherries, I see a lot of them and they're pruned very badly and pruned at the wrong time of the year. So it's good to know what you're pruning and how to prune that particular plant to prevent the spread of pests and disease. So as seen on the previous slide, we've got good horticultural practice to prevent the spread of pests and diseases and other pathogens. One of those is sanitary practices, again mentioned on the previous slide with pruning. But in general, cleaning tools, boots and clothes is really good practice between jobs, and especially when you know you've been in a place that could potentially have pathogens there, to stop the spread. Now, a really good thing to practice is this check, clean and dry. And here we've got check your equipment and clothing for live organisms, particularly in areas that are damp or hard to inspect. Clean and wash all equipment, footwear, thoroughly, and dry all equipment before its next use. Now, this is more to do with working in or near water, but you may well work in or near water in your horticultural role, say in a pond or water body. So this is quite an important thing to remember. It's really, really good for the ornamental value of your pond not to have any invasive species in, for example. Now, a biosecurity kit, putting together a simple portable biosecurity kit may be really, really useful to keep on top of controlling pests and diseases. It can help you implement really simple measures every day to limit the introduction and spread of pests and diseases. So in there you'll have things like a hard brush, some clean cloth, some tissues, and some Virkon or Horticept. So these products here, you've got Horticept and Virkon. These are horticultural disinfectants, and they can be used around water as well, as long as they're used properly. Whereas other disinfectants might not be. They are biocides, so you still need to follow good practice when using them. They will have cost risk assessment forms attached to them and so on, so you do still need to be careful with them, but they are quite safe for working with plants and near water. So sanitary practices in the greenhouse will include cleaning regularly, and that means cleaning the structure and also cleaning trays, pots, and so on. And really a seasonal clean of a polytunnel or a greenhouse is best. So every time you've got sort of spring coming up, that's when you will really do your cleaning. And this can really help stop the spread of pests and diseases in the greenhouse, because a lot of pests and diseases overwinter and will stay in the greenhouse. So for whatever you're growing in the next season, it's quite likely that there'll be some nasties hanging around. It's really, really good practice to clean out your greenhouse. And also for health and safety reasons, it's good to not have clutter and to keep it clean anyway. So we've actually come to the end of this session for you, and in front of you there are just some terms that I've mentioned throughout here. Now do take note of these terms. We've got biosecurity, phytosanitary, pathogen, vector, host, invasive non-native species, and quarantine. So do take note of these. The next slide will have some questions for you to do. So I'd like you to follow the link on this page for a quiz, and it's really, really good for your learning to answer these questions. There's only 10 questions there, and see what you've learned from this session. So I hope that you enjoyed the quiz, and just these last couple of pages now, we've got some resources for you to follow. We've got many of the resources that I've used to create this session. There's a horticultural code of practice, there's some bits about plant passports, understanding good phytosanitary practice. On the next slide there are some more resources for you to follow. So even more resources here, and if you wanted to follow some of these links, feel free to do so. We've got some of the videos and some of the links that I have used in this session. So thank you very much for following this session. I hope that you got something out of it, and I hope that you know a lot more about biosecurity and phytosanitary methods for duty 7 of your apprenticeship. I will be sharing all of these resources. I'll be sharing the slide and the video here with you, so you will be having access to all of these links and everything else that's on the slideshow here.